The mighty sailing ship. For centuries, ships like this had plied the world's oceans, ferrying passengers and cargo to far-flung corners of the globe. But then, in the 1800s, something remarkable happened. Technology rocketed forward at an enormous rate, and the way people travelled the world's oceans was forever changed. Now, voyages that had once taken months could take only weeks or days, and people could enjoy comfort and luxury in an environment that had once spelt terror and danger. It was the rise of the Oceanliner, an incredible piece of technology that harnessed cutting-edge science for the age. Sail gave way to steam, and it would result in the creation of some of the greatest ships in history, some of which are still household names today. From the great highs of triumph and achievement to the crushing despair of loss and tragedy, the story of the transatlantic ocean liner is the story of humanity's battle with the elements, a fight where we've always been the underdog. In this 7-part series, we'll turn back the clock and chart the development of these brilliant machines from their earliest pioneering days to their towering heyday and through to their gradual decline. We'll see what technology went into them, the brilliant engineering and decorating decisions that made them memorable, and touch on only a handful of the true standouts of the ocean liner's golden age. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. This is the true story of how the great ocean liners used technology to end the days of sail and revolutionize travel forever. Once upon a time, if you needed to go somewhere, you had a few limited choices. If it was across country, you'd book a carriage if you could afford it, or even join a wagon train. But travelling internationally was different entirely. There was only one option, and that was by ship. Today, we can jump on a jet in England, fly 20 hours, and end up in Australia, but not too long ago, that was a 3 to 6 month trip, and the voyage was brutal. The ocean is a wild, deadly place. Waves can run mountains high, whipped up by winds that could strip paint off the side of a house. Sailing ships were the vehicle of choice for humankind for centuries, relying on the wind to fill their sails and drive them along. But technological development was slow in the world of sail, and these were hard times. Sailing ships, for one thing, were made mainly out of wood for hundreds of years. Advanced metalworking techniques hadn't yet been discovered or applied to the shipping world, and wooden ships can only be built so big. It meant that for a long time, we could only travel in tiny wooden ships, and the conditions aboard were horrendous. Very little thought was given to comfort. The gloomy inside was only lit by dim oil lamps. Passengers were crammed into cots wherever they could fit. Food was little more than slop, and there was nothing to do for weeks on end except endure the rolling and pitching of the ship and wait. Then, a few important things happened. Iron-hulled ships were developed that could be built much stronger and bigger. Suddenly, ships could take more stress at sea, and passengers got a little bit more comfort, but not much. Ships were still driven by the wind. It meant that companies that operated passenger ships couldn't abide by a regular schedule, because their vessels were totally at the mercy of the wind and the waves. Ships could be stuck in a calm one week, or then find themselves engulfed in a days-long raging storm the next. There was no reliability. And to go to sea, for passengers, was to take your life into your own hands. But then came a massive development. Scientists and inventors had been experimenting with steam power for a long time, making contraptions that could power mills and factories, but in 1783, the French Marquis de Geoffroy d'Abon demonstrated a steam-powered boat, the Pyroscoff. This changed everything. By the early 1800s, steam engines were being mounted on boats and ships of different sizes, and it was the American ship Savannah which famously crossed the Atlantic Ocean first in 1819, even though she was really just a sailing ship with a steam engine and paddle wheels bolted on. It was the brilliant British industrialist Isambard Brunel who first combined steam engines on an iron hull in 1845 with his SS Great Britain, the first of its kind to cross the Atlantic Ocean. This ship was truly ahead of its time. Powered by a propeller instead of a paddle wheel, it could cross the ocean in just 14 days. Without having to rely on fair winds all the time, and with an engine powerful enough to drive it on forward regardless of conditions, a new breed of ship that could maintain regular, reliable crossings was born. The SS Great Britain was the world's first ocean liner. From there, things took off, but for the longest time, sailing ships and clippers remained a favourite for seafarers and shipping companies across the world. Steam engines weren't yet to be trusted. They were seen as unreliable and, even worse, dangerous. They could cause fire at sea and burn a ship to the waterline. It would take some time yet for steam to become the main choice of propulsion and for the ocean liner to prove itself. Enter the White Star Line's SS Atlantic. The year was 1870, and the company had some stiff competition on its hands. At the time, there was a great migration boom, and companies jostled to take control of the market. Offering regular, reliable sailings was very important to the travelling public. The ships that were used by lines at the time were very small and very uncomfortable. The leaking, creaking, wooden-hulled ships were gone, but passenger amenities were very basic. This is where Atlantic and her sisters changed the game. They were the Oceanic class, a class of initially 4 smart liners powered by sail and steam engines that were built to a size and style of comfort never before seen at sea. They were so influential that White Star Line seemed to have surprised themselves and even ordered 2 more to be built afterwards. The first major stepping stone for ship owners was to entice the general public to go to sea in the first place. For too long, people had been suffering in small, dimly lit packet ships being tossed around like a cork. The White Star Line knew that to court more passengers, a new standard of comfort and luxury would have to be set. On the old ships, if you were a well-to-do passenger, you'd have been allotted a small room with a tiny cot to squeeze into. There were no public rooms. If you were lucky, you'd be invited to take meals with the captain in the great cabin at the stern of the ship, but otherwise your only areas to explore would be your cabin and the upper deck. Atlantic and the other 5 Oceanic-class steamers were like a space-age leap forward. Across 2 passenger decks were spread a small variety of rooms for cabin class or first-class passengers to enjoy. Amidships was an ornate dining saloon with comfortable seating that during the day could serve as a lounge. It even had a pair of bookcases and 2 working marble fireplaces. Ladies had their own boudoir and toilets and faucets with running water, and within convenient walking distance were neat, well-appointed single or double cabins that were a remarkable step ahead when compared to the older ships. Fascinatingly, the bathrooms were steam heated. These were some of the first ships to have any such system set in place. Hot water was even available, heated by steam straight from the boilers. If you needed to get a steward's attention, you could actually ring an electric bell and summon him. The migrant class were berthed in dormitories forward of and behind the cabin class rooms. They were provided with 4 hospital compartments and available bedding, something that many other ships had simply never offered. The Oceanic class's design allowed for substantially better ventilation than what would have been seen on ships previously, and far better lighting. These ships had dozens of abnormally large portholes to allow natural light in, a revolutionary and thoughtful step in an era where steerage passengers were previously simply locked away below deck in ships that had no portholes cut into the hull and practically forgotten about until the voyage was over. Not only that, but up on deck, the big cargo hatch covers were fitted with massive skylights that could allow even more natural light to flood in from above. Even if berthed on the tween deck, the lowest deck, for passengers, plenty of natural light would still be let in. With that much bright light, a passenger could easily forget they were even so far down within the ship. Early on, Atlantic's migrant passengers had nowhere to take their meals. They simply ate on small benches at the ends of their bunks, But then after an 1872 refit, migrants were given their own benches to eat at. It doesn't sound like much, but it was a big deal for the time when migrants were often otherwise considered little more than cattle. Atlantic and her sisters were industrial wonders when they were introduced from 1871. The contemporary press described them as being more like an imperial yacht than a passenger liner. The White Star Line had wanted to capture the market's attention by focusing on comfort, and they did just that. But comfort was not all, and even great passenger ships are at the mercy of the world's vast oceans. In 1873, the Atlantic met a violent and terrifying end, but that's a tale for another day. Atlantic and the other Oceanic-class ships were still early steamers, relying heavily on sails to draw their speed. These were still the early days of iron-hulled shipbuilding too. For the Oceanliner to truly triumph over the sailing ship, passenger vessels would need to be bigger and allow more space and amenities. Size was important. It meant ships could handle the wild oceans easier, and it meant passengers would be drawn to what they thought was a bigger and safer ship. Just 13 years after the White Star Line had introduced the Atlantic and the other Oceanic-class ships, their competition Cunard Line was hard at work drafting a new generation of liner that would capture the public's imagination. The result was the RMS Umbria and her sister Etruria, largely forgotten to history now, but game changers in their own right. Atlantic had been a revolutionary step forward in her day at 3,700 tons, but by Umbria's time, ships had grown in size. The Cunard liner was 7,100 gross registered tons and 100 or so feet longer. This increase in size didn't come out of nowhere. A huge technological jump forward had made it possible: the introduction of steel. When designers and builders figured out they could build a ship's hull from iron, it had been a eureka moment. Ships could be built much larger and withstand a greater strain thanks to the sheer strength of the metal. But iron, a core element found in the earth, is strong at the expense of its weight. But in the mid-1800s, a new building material had been introduced that changed everything and made all iron hulls redundant. Steel is an alloy that combines the properties of iron and carbon to create a much stronger, lighter material. It's less likely to fracture under stress, and more of it can be used in a ship's construction without gaining much weight. Back in Umbria's day, when steam engines were relatively underpowered, this was important. You could build a much bigger ship and still go as fast as you needed to maintain that regular crossing schedule. Umbria's hull was made of steel, and when she was launched in 1884, she was a marvel. The new Cunarder was the largest ship afloat and in service, and with an increase in size came a few massive benefits. A steel hull meant that Umbria could be only 1/5 longer than Atlantic, but with almost twice the internal volume, meaning Cunard could install a huge variety of rooms and amenities for passengers that would make the Oceanic class seem like they were a century old. Instead of relying on a single main saloon, serving a variety of functions, Umbria's first class got access to a suite of spaces, including a smoking room, a music room, and a ladies' private salon. Even second class got their own smoking and ladies' room, and at last, unlike on Atlantic, their own dining room. The spaces were richly and ornately decorated with carvings and heavy velvet furnishings. In this age, passengers could at last forget, even momentarily, that they were on a ship and might be forgiven for thinking they were actually in a fine hotel. There was another huge change too. Atlantic and ships like her were still lit by oil-burning lamps, but Umbria and her sister ship were lit throughout by electric bulbs, eliminating the fire risk of oil and enhancing the image of comfort and modernity at sea. From the outside, though, there was another huge visual change that conveyed sheer power. Umbria could still rig sails. In fact, she and Etruria were the last to be rigged as barks, but clearly they didn't just need to rely on sail anymore. Steam had proved itself at last, and while ships still kept sails as an auxiliary or a backup, they didn't depend on them. Just looking at Umbria's layout, you can tell that sails were no longer the main event. Instead, onlookers would have been drawn to the two enormous smokestacks in the middle of the ship. These two funnels gave the ship an air of size, power, and confidence, and highlighted the fact that the Umbria was powered by a reliable steam engine. The relationship between funnels and giving an impression of size and speed was born in this era, and future generations of liner would take this to its extreme. But size brought other benefits. Bigger ships could carry more coal, more boilers, and larger engines. Not only that, but a longer hull form is more efficient at moving through the water. It meant that Umbria was fast for her day, capturing the transatlantic speed record at 19 knots. But she still carried old compound steam engines like the Atlantic had. And also, like that older ship, she only used a single propeller. For ships to go faster while getting bigger, this would have to change. And so too would safety standards. Now, the next big technological leap forward focused on safety at sea that would prevent ships from being sunk by minor incidents and then tempt the general public to be brave and sail away with confidence in their ship. The year was 1888, just a short 4 years since the Umbria had been introduced, and already the next generation of ocean liner had been born. Once steel became the main ingredient for building ships, the sky was the limit. Suddenly, there was no restriction on the size of a ship because weight and strength of ships' hulls had at last caught up. Enter the SS City of New York and her sister City of Paris, two of the most beautiful ships to ever sail and absolute pioneers for their time. Umbria had been a smash hit back in 1884, but City of New York, conceived by the British Inman Line, absolutely dwarfed her. Umbria had been 7,100 gross registered tons, but City of New York was an enormous 10,500. We already know that a bigger ship means more space for passengers, but City of New York wasn't just big, she was fast. This 560-foot-long giant could steam along at 20 knots, and she and her sister stole the speed record from Umbria and Etruria, and the secret to their success was simple: another technological leap forward that would change the ocean liner forever. Umbria and Atlantic had both been employed by an early type of engine called a compound steam engine. This type of engine dated all the way back to the 1700s and worked by pushing steam through massive cylinders in 2 stages. This meant your engine could capture the power of the steam as it entered the first cylinder at high pressure before it was blasted into the next cylinder in the engine at a lower pressure. City of New York's engines improved on this concept. These were bigger triple expansion steam engines that introduced a 3rd stage, capturing the power of steam at high, medium, and low pressures. This type of steam engine became the standard for passenger ships right up into the 20th century, powering monstrous ocean liners like Olympic and Titanic that were 4 or 5 times larger than the City of New York was. But that was still a long way off. Back in 1888, the City of New York's triple expansion engines were a big deal, but not just in and of themselves. The City of New York's real secret was below the waterline outside of the hull, because instead of just 1 propeller, the new Inman ship boasted 2. This was the first time a pair of propellers was mounted to an express liner. Ships with single propellers had been prone to shaft failure. It meant that they had to carry all those extra sails and rigging in case the propeller shaft broke. But a twin-propellered ship doesn't need to worry about that. The City of New York didn't need to carry sails for propulsion. From the outside, she still looked a little old-fashioned with the 3 masts and that long bowsprit, the spar that emerged from the ship's bow, a relic from the days of sail. But these features were mainly just for looks. The City of New York was every bit a modern liner, and the twin propellers coupled to the powerful triple expansion steam engines meant that this massive ship could steam faster than the smaller, more lithe Umbria. Of course, the new Inman ships brought even greater enhancements to passenger comfort and luxuries, but aside from their size and power plant, the real major developments were to safety at sea. In the early days, a breach in the hull meant that the ship could be doomed. The outer skin was only a single layer thick, and the interior of ships weren't split into sections, meaning any water flowing in could have its run of the hull. Ships like the City of New York changed everything. She was fitted with a full-length double bottom, then a revolutionary feature. It was essentially a second inner skin that would protect the ship from any damage on grounding, a fairly common accident type at the time. The inside of the ship's hull was then subdivided into 16 watertight compartments by tall steel bulkheads that rose up inside the ship's hull like walls. Thanks to disasters like the sinking of Titanic, we're all well aware of how these generally worked and where they might fail, but at the time, this kind of technology was essentially brand new and as yet untested. In fact, the City of New York's bulkheads were even better designed than that of future ships like Titanic. They went as high in the hull as the upper decks, meaning that closing the watertight doors would completely prevent water from spilling over the top. Then the ship was divided lengthways as well. A midline bulkhead separated all the boiler and engine rooms into two. If one side of the ship was pierced in a collision, then the water was contained only to that boiler or engine room. With the others undamaged and dry, she could still move under her own power. The extensive, almost obsessive subdividing of the City of New York and her sister ship, the City of Paris, would actually come in very handy. In 1890, the City of Paris was steaming for Liverpool when her engines raced and then disintegrated. The force was like an explosion. Chunks of engine block pierced the hull and water roared in, but the watertight bulkheads kept her safe and she was towed to port. 9 years later, the same ship was off Cornwall when a navigational error resulted in the ship grounding hard on the rocks. Less than a year earlier, the steamer Mohegan had hit these same rocks and sank with the loss of 106 lives. And City of Paris suffered extensive damage and was thought to be a write-off, but thanks to her intricate construction, she was salvaged and towed to Belfast, where she was completely repaired and returned to service. This kind of damage would have and did sink ships from earlier decades, but the huge technological jumps forward in such a short amount of time meant that passenger ships were much, much safer by the time the City of New York was around. With the introduction of Inman's two glamorous and technologically advanced city ships, the Oceanliner could flaunt an impressive safety suite, but their engines were still relatively fragile. City of Paris's had exploded in 1890 after all. For the steamship to truly win out, naval architects and engineers would need to refine the marine steam engine and iron out all the kinks and get rid of sail for good. In 1892, Cunard Line introduced two ships that did just this. They were named Campania and Lucania. RMS Campania was a smartly proportioned liner, launched just 4 years after the City of New York, but she was the largest passenger ship afloat at the time of her launch at 12,950 gross registered tons. Ships were getting bigger and bigger all the time. Campania's real technological leap was way down in her engine room. Umbria had used a 2-stage compound steam engine, and then the City of New York had been propelled with that pair of huge triple expansion steam engines. Campania set out to sea with the largest triple expansion steam engines ever fitted to a Cunard steamship, full stop. They stood 47 feet high, about the height of a 3-story building, so tall in fact that they reared up from the bottom of the ship right up to about the level of her superstructure on the upper decks. The engines turned twin propellers and their sheer power could drive the ship through the ocean at a record-breaking 23.5 knots. In Campania, the Oceanliner could now cross the Atlantic in 5 days, 12 hours. Just 50 years earlier, it would have taken you 2 weeks in the fastest steamship and a month in a sailing ship. Campania looked the part, taking what Umbria had started with her twin funnels and evolving it to almost freakish proportions. The ship boasted 2 enormous smokestacks that conveyed a real sense of power and stability. Not only that, but the sails and the multiple masts, they were long gone. Here, at last, was a very modern-looking steamship, and the pattern had been established. Future ocean liners like Lusitania and Mauretania would look almost identical to Campania, just much larger and with more funnels. The ships still sported masts, but these now served a different purpose, being used to support cargo-carrying derricks that could aid in loading the ship full of valuable freight. Inside, though, the ships boasted some spectacular spaces. The dining saloon was like the soaring foyer of a palace with rows of red velvet chairs for the affluent to eat, laugh, and while the night away. Staircases, too, were no longer just utilitarian affairs. They were crucial to connecting the ship's interior spaces, and they earned a character all their own. The grand staircase was born, a central hub for getting about the ship, that was bathed in natural light from skylights above. The salons and the rooms were nothing short of superb, and Cunard spared no expense in ensuring their two celebrated sisters would be the toast of the Atlantic. Campania and Lucania relied on their powerful engines to drive them to Atlantic glory. In fact, between them, they held the prestigious Blue Ribbon prize for the fastest Atlantic crossing for half a decade. But then, in 1898, a ship came along that took the world by storm. So far, we've looked at 4 special classes of ship that epitomised a technological development that drove the ocean liner to seagoing supremacy. Atlantic for her comfort, Umbria for her size, the City of New York for her safety, and Campania for her power. But 6 years after Campania was introduced on the transatlantic run, another ship came along that combined all these developments into one and dominated the waves. This ship created a stir and set a new standard for each of those 4 areas of ocean-going travel. Unlike the last 4 ships, she wasn't British, she was German. This ship took the blue ribbon from Campania and Lucania in one fell swoop and shocked the British public. She was named Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse. This ship has gone down in ocean liner legend as revolutionary, but it might be fairer to say that she was actually evolutionary, drawing on the lessons and the technology that had been refined by the grand ships that had come before it. In Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse, the ocean liner of the 19th century had reached its peak. Less than 80 years earlier, sluggish paddle steamers had chugged their way through the ocean, crossing the Atlantic in a couple of weeks, but the Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse could do the trip in 5 days flat. But that wasn't all. She was infinitely more luxurious than Atlantic had been just 30 years prior. Inside, the Kaiser boasted palatial saloons and lounges with a first-class dining room 2 stories tall. Atlantic's passengers had been content with one saloon, but on the Kaiser they could choose between drawing and smoking rooms, a Vienna cafe, a library, and stretch their legs on multiple promenade decks. Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse was the first liner to boast suites with adjoining bedrooms, bathrooms, and parlours. Umbria had entered service with a steel hull and enormous tonnage for her time, but the Kaiser was more than 2 times bigger with all the benefits. The City of New York had pioneered a new standard of safety at sea, and the Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse incorporated all of those developments: watertight bulkheads and doors, a double bottom, but the Kaiser boasted an additional safety feature. Lining the ship's upper decks were 20 lifeboat stations to the City of New York's 12, even though she carried 100 more people. The Campania's enormous engines had captured the blue ribbon, but the Kaiser's powerful triple expansion steam engines and her increased length actually made her faster. The ship captured the blue ribbon back from Campania and her sister Lucania in March 1898. Campania and Lucania had proudly carried 2 immense funnels to convey their size and power, but the Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse upped the ante. She was the first liner to carry 4. These carried smoke from the boilers and weren't just for looks. 4 funnels provided the optimal draft required to efficiently heat the boilers. The result was terrific. The world was impressed by the sight of a 4-funneled ship, and the idea immediately caught on. To build and launch passenger liners on the transatlantic run that had less than 4 funnels from then on would appear weak. Overnight, every liner that had been built and launched before this German superliner seemed incredibly outdated. The Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse was impressive, and its 4 funnels definitely changed the game. But it was pioneering liners like Atlantic, Umbria, City of New York, and Campania that had tested new technologies and helped secure the future of ocean-going travel for the ocean liner. The humble sailing ship was left far behind. Soon, they would all be retired from service, their crews laid off, and desperate to forget life-learned skills like sail-making and rope knotting for steam-oriented ones, coal trimming, and engineering. Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse's speed record saw out the 19th century. In that short 100 years, ships had developed so quickly and rapidly that regulations had little time to keep up. Anything seemed possible. A 20,000-ton ship, a 50,000-ton ship. It was all achievable thanks to the efforts of these older vessels, but it had all been perfected in Germany's new superliner. Across the world, shipping companies looked at the Kaiser's 4 golden funnels and set urgently to work on designing their own 4-stacker superliners to challenge the throne. A new technological arms race had begun that would define the early years of the 20th century and see some of history's greatest ever ships built. It was the dawning of the age of the 4-funneled ocean liner, but that's a story for another day.